Hey guys, so today I am going to share with you um, an American classic. It is one of the books that I read probably in sixth grade that really has left such a mark on me as a reader. And it is perhaps the only book I have ever read as a child where I know exactly where I was when I read a specific part in the book. And I've been really wanting to recommend this book for a while to you guys, just haven't had the opportunity. But this is the book, Old Yeller. And it's very possible that your parents have read this book if you haven't read it. But this is realistic fiction. Any of you who are animal lovers, this is definitely the book for you. If you are somebody with a dog, I would recommend this. The story actually takes place in about the 1860s out in Texas on a ranch. And so as you're reading it, you're also reading their dialect. So that can be a challenge at times, but it also can be really fun if you are at home and you're wanting to try to sound like a Texan out on a ranch. But let me share this book with you. When his father sets out on a cattle drive for the summer, 14-year-old Travis is left to take care of his family and their farm, and he faces new, unanticipated, and often perilous responsibilities in the wilderness of the early frontier Texas. But Travis is not alone. He finds help and comfort in the courage and unwavering love of the stray animal who comes to be his most loyal and very best friend. The big yellow dog Travis calls Old Yeller. So let me get started for you. We called him Old Yeller. The name had a sort of double meaning. One part meant that his short hair was a dingy yellow, a color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. I remember like yesterday how he strayed in out of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so mad at first that I wanted to kill him. Then, later, when I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot some of my own folks. That's how much I'd come to think of the big yeller dog. He came in the late 1860s, the best I can remember. Anyhow, it was the year that Papa and a bunch of other Salt Lick settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steer and trailed them to the new cattle market in Kansas. This was to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those years right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country and a good one. As Papa pointed out that the day the men talked over making the drive, we had plenty of grass, wood, and water. We had wild game for the killing, fertile ground for growing bread corn, and the Indians had been put onto reservations with the return of U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Papa wound up, all we lack having a tight tail hold on the world is a little cash money. And we can't get that. And we can get that, Kansas. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Kansas was better than 600 miles north of the Texas hill country we lived in. It would take months for the men to make the drive and ride back home, and all that time the womenfolk and children of Salt Licks would be left in a wild frontier settlement to make out the best they could. Still, they needed money, and then realized that whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it all over with each other and with their women and decided it was the thing to do. They told their folks what to do in case the Indians came off the reservation, or the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. Then they gathered their cattle, burned a trail brand on their hips, and pulled out on the long trail to Kansas. I remember how it was the day Papa left. I remember his standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his gun on his side, and his bedroll tied on back of the canteen. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked with his high-crowned hat and his black mustache drooping in cow horn curves. This way then. Past the corner of his mouth. And I remember how Mama was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how Little Arliss, who was only 5 and didn't know much, wasn't trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off, not because Papa was leaving, but because he couldn't go too. I wasn't about to cry. I was 14 years old, pretty near a grown man. I stood back and didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. Papa got through loving up Mama and little Arliss and mounted his horse. I looked up at him. He motioned for me to come along, so I walked beside his horse down the trail that led under the big live oaks and past the spring. When he'd gotten out of hearing of the house, Papa reached down and put a hand on my shoulder. "Now, Travis," he said, "you're getting to be a big boy, and while I'm gone, you'll be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Mama and little Arliss. You look after the work and don't wait around for your mama to point out what needs to be done. Think you can do that?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Now, there's the cows to milk, wood to cut, and young pigs to mark, and fresh meat to shoot. And mainly, there's the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the varmints eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread corn for the winter." "Yes, sir," I said. "All right, boy. I'll be seeing you this fall." I stood there and let him ride on. There wasn't any more to say. Suddenly, I remembered and went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted around in the saddle. "Yeah, boy," he said. "What is it?" "That horse," I said. "What horse?" he said, like he'd never heard me mention it before. "You mean you're wanting a horse?" "Now, Papa," I complained, "you know I've been aching all over for a horse to ride. I've told you time and again." I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I hadn't realized he was teasing. "What you're needing worse than a horse is a good dog." "Yes, sir," I said, "but a horse is what I'm wanting the worst." "All right," he said, "you act a man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see that you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. Think we can shake on that deal." He reached out his hand and we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man. It made me feel big and solemn and important in a way I'd never felt before. I knew then that I could handle whatever needed to be done while Papa was gone. I turned and started back up the trail toward the cabin. I guess maybe Papa was right. I guess I could use a dog. All the other settlers had a dog. They were big, fierce cur dogs that the settlers used for catching hogs and driving cattle and fighting coons out on the cornfield. They kept them as watchdogs against the depredation of loafers, wolves, bears, panthers, and raiding Indians. There was no question about it. For the sort of country we lived in, a good dog around this place was something worth more than 2 or 3 men. I knew this as well as anybody, because the summer before, I had a good dog. His name was Bell. He was nearly as old as I was. We'd had him ever since I could remember. He'd protected me from rattlesnakes and bad hogs while I was little. He'd hunted with me when I was bigger. Once he dragged me out of Birdsong Creek when I was about to drown, and another time he'd given warning in time to keep some raiding Comanches from stealing and eating our mule Jumper. Then he had to go act a fool and get himself killed. It was while Papa and I were cutting wild hay in a little patch of prairie back in the house. Big Diamondback rattlers stuck at Pa, and Papa chopped his head off with one quick lick of his scythe. The head dropped to the ground 3 or 4 feet away from the writhing body. It lay there with the ugly mouth opening and shutting, still trying to bite something. As smart as Bell was, you'd have thought he'd have been better sense than to go up and nuzzle that rattler's head. But he didn't, and a second later he was falling back, howling and slinging his own head till his ears popped. But it was too late then. That snake mouth had snapped shut on his nose, driving the fangs in so deep that it was a full minute before he could sling the bloody head loose. He died that night, and I cried for a week. Papa tried to make me feel better by promising to get me another dog right away, but I wouldn't have had it. It made me mad just to think about some other dogs trying to take Bell's place. And I still felt the same about it. All I wanted now was a horse. All right. So that's starting to set the scene. We're out on the prairies. And you heard on that first page that when he first meets Old Yeller, he's not too happy about it. So if you keep reading, you'll find out the situation there. But also, though, if you like this book, once you read it, Disney does have the movie. And it's just as good, but I think it's much more powerful to read the book first.